I'm Sarah Burke, and this is the Women in Media podcast. I'm excited about today's episode because not only will I get to spend some time with some of the most brilliant women that I know in the media, who I'm proud to call friends, but together today, collectively, we have many years of experience and many different perspectives on the past, present, and future of the music industry. Just a couple questions, especially if you're someone who doesn't work in the music industry. How often do you consider how music makes its way to you? And when it's on the radio, do you think about who makes the decisions behind what you're playing? How many women you hear in, say, an hour of time? If you could even name a trans artist. This Women in Media panel will welcome some of the best to talk about a recent landmark music study titled Share the Air. This study was conducted in dedication to the women, trans artists, and artists of color who have been denied their share of the air. As in, their music has not been heard on your radio. And we're so lucky to have a few of the collaborators with us today who will tell you more about the study and their reactions. Let's start with introductions so people can understand who you are and your connection to research like this and get to know your voices. Jada, please start us off.
Sure. I'm Jada Watson, assistant professor in the School of Information Studies at the University of Ottawa, and I was the lead researcher on Share the Air through my research program, Songdata.
I'm Bronwin Parks. I am the heroically foul-mouthed creative director at Feisty Creative, and I worked with Jada on building the visuals for the project, as well as working through some of the digital marketing pieces. And I've been sort of involved in, equity and inclusion type stuff for a long time. And it's really, a big part of what I do alongside my normal work stuff. So
I am Robyn Stewart. I'm the executive director of Women in Music Canada. I worked alongside Jada and Bronwin and Heather at National Arts Centre in producing this, getting together the support to make it happen, and carrying this forward with the incredible work of the team, as our interest really is lying in how do we make change and make the air more equitable so that it makes change across the whole ecosystem. So that's very much a driver of what we're doing at Women in Music Canada.
Hey everyone, my name is Keziah. I am the Executive Director of Advance, Canada's Black Music Business Collective. I am very much interested in this research, and so when Robyn and Jada brought it over to me, I hopped at the opportunity to partner and collaborate on how we make change long-term and how we build an opportunity for others to be able to engage with us as we make this change. In terms of connection to research like this, at Advance, we have been conducting research similar to this for a couple of years. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence, and we've been taking a look at the Black-owned radio stations across the country, which of course would be used to promote Black artists, Black identifying artists, and those that are within various genres that in some cases may not be played on other radio stations. So I'm very excited to be a part of this research and the development of what it can be nationwide and globally.
Anin Bojo, Jaushkoven Azekwe Desnikas, Megazito Dem, Bachuana, and Donjiba, Ojibwe, and Anishinaabe, and Dao. My name is ShoShona Kish, and I grew up in Toronto, but my family is from Bachuana, and I have family ties to Garden River. And I am an artist, I would say first, but I am also the artistic director of the International Indigenous Music Summit and co-founder of Ishkodé Records, and been working on launching the newly minted Indigenous Music Office.
Like I said, all the best of the best, all in one digital recording studio right now. And all of these incredible humans have been on the podcast before, doing their own sort of discussion about what they do and their work day to day. So please go back into the back catalog and check out their episodes. But I think we have to start with this research study, how it came together. And this is probably something that Jada and Robyn will want to talk about.
Sure. I would say that the first spark for me was being tired of seeing very imbalanced stages and festivals. And as a talent buyer, I knew that it didn't come down to the obvious answer of attack the talent buyer, because they aren't the only part of this ecosystem. And it's not just them saying, we're just going to push white male artists. And so it was a lot of looking at where that comes from and talking to talent buyers and festival producers about how does it get to this place where it's not balanced. And there's so many pieces along the ecosystem of developing an artist's career that can make change in that. And so I had initially wanted to do a study around that, around looking at how the ecosystem all the way across can be changed. And that was pretty vague. But then was speaking with Shauna DeCartier of ShoShona Records, who was very interested in similar things, but wanted to look at radio. And I think that's when my mind opened to this is a really key and great place to start, because it really is the center of the ecosystem in terms of development, because it speaks to what artists are being developed, what artists are being signed by labels of different size. And then it also reflects beyond that as to what artists are getting success in ticket sales and touring successfully and being booked as headliners. And so it really is a hinge pin, I think, in that flow. Even if some would say radio is in some genres not as important, it really still is quite a big thing. And in those genres that aren't represented as much on radio, I think it could definitely be if they were. And where I will start passing over to Jada is that her and Heather Gibson from National Arts Center had been speaking for a long time about a similar study. And we were all brought together by Shauna's connection to go, we're all looking to do the same thing. Let's do it together. And so from there, I'll pass over to Jada.
Yeah. Heather and I were actually having much the same conversation, but just here in Ottawa. We had met months earlier, sort of informally with no plan to collaborate. And then she wrote me an email maybe 6 months later saying, hey, I was just having a chat with Shauna DeCartier at ShoShona Records. I think we should talk more. And so the three of us started meeting and we're talking about what could be done. And I immediately saw a pathway through. I've been researching radio airplay for 6 years now. I think I'm in my sixth year of anniversary of this work. And I immediately saw a pathway through by looking at the formats that are monitored by Mediabase, because that's the database that I use for my research, looking at representation within the year-end reports, and then doing a deep dive into the most current year to look at various facets of airplay. So not just straight airplay, but the time of day, how this shook out for current recurrent gold songs, for CanCon designations. So, were formats meeting it? If so, how? And how did this impact artists within the ecosystem? And so at that point, after having written a proposal to do that, we were then put in touch with Robyn, who did the phenomenal lifting of applying for the funding for this work and has managed that whole side of it. So I thankfully did not have to think about money once, which was nice.
Okay, so I would love to now throw to some of the other panelists for just sort of first impressions and shocking revelations from this report in terms of the voices that you represent. So Kez, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I'm going to say not surprised. The unfortunate reality is I was not surprised by the research. And in this particular case, the research is showing, less than 1% of women are coming from groups that are culturally diverse as a whole, as a lump sum. And so that lack of surprise says something about the journey for Black artists within the ecosystem. If I am not an artist and I am working within, in this case, I've been working in this industry for 17 years, and I'm not surprised at such a low number, it does mean that it has affected the entire ecosystem. And it reminds me of how much work there is still to do. And it is a good opportunity to start the conversation with data. One of the things that I think our industry is really great at is amplifying voices, but they've always been the same voices and putting people's on stage. And a lot of times they've been the same people we've seen on stages. So we have the mechanism. And so if we have the mechanism and we can utilize that mechanism for others coming from various experiences and groups, and in this particular case, a lot of those Black artists are performing the largest genre in the world. So if we look at streaming in comparison to radio, you'll see that Black music dominates the charts there, bringing in about $339 million annually, and 65 to 75% of streaming.
Thanks for bringing the receipts.
Anytime. But radio is so important to what Robyn said earlier of being a central piece to the ecosystem. Different, interestingly enough, than streaming. And so when looking at this research, although not surprising, and yes, subsequently also disheartening, there's an opportunity because of this research and data that we can move in spaces and say, no, just because you hear hip hop or rap all the time doesn't mean that the Black woman who is practicing rap from, Surrey, BC is getting any airplay.
Very true. I'm going to throw to you, ShoShona, now. And I just want to say, ShoShona is fresh off of the International Indigenous Music Summit and rallied to be here. And thank you for being here. I know that you're not feeling your best, but yeah, your thoughts, your first revelations when you took a look at the research.
Yeah, none of it was surprising to me, to echo Keziah. Like, we know what's going on out there. We're seeing it happen. I'm a brown woman. I'm an Indigenous woman who's been working in the space for 20 years. I'm keenly aware of the challenges and barriers. And I'm also keenly aware of the history of Indigenous voices being silenced, like legally silenced, where it was illegal and, and persecutable to sing our songs and tell our stories. And it was not, that is in living memory. It's not hundreds of years ago. The potlatch ban, which is sort of the colloquial name for the law, that law lasted until 1958. So, we're seeing and emerged in the same environment as the music industry. So I think, those histories are not irrelevant to these conversations. The silencing of brown and Black voices and women's voices is not new. So, I think what's exciting right now is we needed this data to be able to make the case, because, the other thing that happens is that folks deny that it's happening. And so, the people who are in positions to make change needed this, and we needed it to continue our work, because we know what's going on out there, and we know the possibility of something different happening. Like, what's going to happen when we get to hear all of these voices? And I think that's really exciting, because the wholeness of our stories being told changes the fabric of who we are together. And, that's my investment. I know the magic of stories. I know what happens when the circle is whole. And so, I think that's at the foundation of the work that I've been doing around representation, but also just like, how can we build something that is consistent with our real values, and create the will to actually make those brave changes.
And I do want this to be a hopeful discussion where, I think people like us who are having these conversations after the report's published, after the month that celebrates whatever it is, those are the people who can rally the community in whichever way for change. And Bronwin, I actually want to throw to you next, because yes, you were a huge part of this research in the design world, but I feel like from the perspective of someone from the queer community, programming queer artists, right? Even when you think about the artists that you love and what you've maybe heard historically on the radio, would you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the queer community also hasn't, had a ton of airplay as the data shows, and echoing what like Keziah and ShoShona said, like I'm also not surprised. It's also sort of disheartening to see that, like, you know, while there is a wealth of, you know, music coming from the 2S LGBTQIA plus community in Canada, they're not getting airplay. So even despite the like immense success of like Sam Smith and Kim Petras, like Canadian queers are very like are not really seen anywhere, to be totally honest. And so that's a little disappointing. But one thing I think we have to remember too is like some people say that like, oh, you know, radio is dying. Why does it matter? Well, first of all, you don't even think about the places you actually hear radio. You know, like I was talking to my neighbor's kid who is like, I think she's like 8 or 9 or something. And she's obsessed with Taylor Swift. And we're like, well, I'm always curious, like, where did you hear Taylor Swift? And her first answer was like, she's famous, duh. And I'm like, okay, but like, where did you hear Taylor Swift? And she's like, at the shopping mall. I'm like, okay, of course. Like they pipe that shit in. And there's all these other like passive places where you're hearing this music, whether it's the grocery store or whatever. And so like radio still plays a role in the music sort of ecosystem. And I think that's important to remember, despite like how fast streaming takes on a bigger role and all this other kind of stuff. It does help some artists to have that other outlet when radio is so clearly not paying attention. But I think it is part of an artist's life cycle
and trajectory.
Like, between labels, management, booking, you know, radio plays a role because it's all spokes in one wheel. So if one spoke isn't there, then it's not seen as like a viable wheel, right? Like, oh, well, this artist isn't going to work because they don't have management or they don't have a label. So if they can't get signed or if they can't get on radio, like it sort of starts to weaken the whole system around that artist. So I think that that's sort of critical to remember that, like, you know, also radio is one of the few places other than maybe festival lineups where you can like literally commodify. Like they are required to release this information so that we can like make sure that they're paying attention. But this doesn't, like, when you think of the ecosystem, labels, like they don't release that information, booking agents, like their rosters change all the time. So there is no like concrete way to even study those other areas in like, you know, so I got to give, like, as much as like this is kind of like a bit of a like hate on radio, like I got to give radio props for like at least doing the due diligence of being like reporting. But
it's
now
mandated,
we're at the phase,
by the way.
Yeah, it's mandated. They have to like report. But also now comes the time of like being accountable.
Yes.
So they've reported, okay, this is the data. Like nobody is like making assumptions here. Like we have literally counted. These are literally the number of people you are playing versus not. So like now's the time to say, okay, we need to be able to fix this.
And this is the time that I'm most interested in this sort of panel discussion. And first, let me just say that the link to this data and this report is going to be in the show notes and on both the websites, womeninmedia.network and womeninmedia.ca, if you want to dig further. But you know, I should also mention, you know, for anyone who's not familiar with me and is maybe landing on this conversation from one of my panelists, I have 15 years experience in radio programming, and being on the other end of some of these discussions, you know, of course, this wasn't even a thought that was something that was part of the conversation in my coming up in radio. And I became aware of this, I would say, starting like with some of my work at SiriusXM, which is like my last corporate job before starting this podcast network. And I remember, you know, the discussion starting around doing more internal tracking. And there's like an ick that comes with the tracking because you feel it's, again, with that word commodify, I think that you mentioned, Bronwin, is what's sticking out for me here, because it's like the data is necessary, the tracking is necessary, but it involves a process in which the art and the human become a stat, you know? And and a tick of a box. And that's what I really struggled with when I was in programming positions. And this might be the perfect time to bring up a somewhat divisive question, but how do we feel about quotas, gender quotas, for example? Like that was brought up in the presentation that happened during Canadian Music Week. And Jada, I'll throw to you.
Yeah, it is a question that comes up a lot. And I understand entirely why it's coming up. We're already in a very regulated system, right? Like there's not really another radio model in the world that has regulations for language and content the way we do. The way into this response. So a couple of things. I think the results already show that while those regulations are important because without them, Canadian artists would not be played, there's a whole different cycle of inequity that happens within the way in which CanCon is even programmed, that this report touches on, but I think there's still miles to go. And that would require work like by format to think about the ways in which at this moment, some of the companies that run their stations or how they run their CanCon programming, it's changing right now. And we're seeing certain companies like think about the ways in which they might do away with medium and low rotation spots for CanCon, which if that happens, is going to create an even more harmful and homogenous system. So I'd start there and then say the impetus for a lot of folks, and I say this based on what I was seeing happen in the US country music industry, is to add and stir, to add in what is missing and hope that those songs will do the work. Visibility counts. It's really powerful. It's really important. I would never dismiss it, but it's a piece of the picture because the rest of the system around it won't or isn't changing at the same time. So I'm concerned for the greater harms that would come when we focus on one piece of programming by adding in some kind of legislation for women, because quite frankly, this is an industry that was born, and I think Keziah and ShoShona highlighted this already, on a continent that was colonized, where Indigenous peoples weren't allowed to tell their stories, and then within a framework of racial segregation. And it wasn't just labels, it was radio, it was charts, it was formats. And so I think it's integral that when we look at this result, and it's why I did the study the way I did. Yes, we focus on gender, but it's through this lens of intersectionality that understands that who these artists are when they're in different formats, which all have their own conventions, that each artist has a different set of circumstances that either create a clear pathway or a series of blockages so that they can't be programmed. So I think first and foremost that some kind of quota for advocating for women could potentially create harm for artists of color. Because I think ultimately every time we see these quota-based initiatives that happen within society, I think of who benefited the most from affirmative action. It was typically white women.
Yeah, it's still going to be white women.
So, yeah, I'm really concerned that any type of quota will first and foremost, if radio even does it, will influence a trajectory for white women only and will create greater inequities for women of color. There are more than two genders. Gender is complex and fluid and ever changing, and putting a strict quota leaves no room for the future. It leaves no room for change. Yeah. So the impact on transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, two-spirit artists is significant. And then to go back to where I started, I think that because of the way in which CanCon is already being programmed, that there's a great potential harm for Canadian women trans artists and artists of color who are already underprogrammed within CanCon.
Yeah.
And I suspect that a gender quota would be like, all right, you want more women? We'll give you more Taylor Swift. Like, I just, that's the way I see it going based on these results, because no matter which area you look at, Golds, CanCon, straight airplay, white women are always in a better position than everybody else.
Yeah. We always have to talk about privilege, especially in these settings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, white women are disadvantaged in the system, but nowhere near the disadvantage that Black, Indigenous artists of color and trans artists are experiencing.
I want to open this same question up to the rest of the panelists here, but very quickly, I just want to mention a piece of context about even tracking in the radio landscape. So dependent on your license, right? Whether we're talking terrestrial radio, my license at SiriusXM was very different. We were tracking new, which was song release dates within 6 months. Emerging, there's a point when an artist becomes no longer emerging. A song you put in the system in, call it June 2024, will not be considered new and emerging at, say, October of 2026. And so that's where everything is moving, and all of the systems that are currently in place for even tracking and data, we need a full revamp of all of this stuff. And that's where a lot of people give up and feel overwhelmed. And anyway, just a piece of context about tracking in the radio landscape, because that was also very challenging. Like, I had to put reminders in my calendar of like when to go and take a qualification off a song. And like, to do that for all the artists in your library, it's not realistic. Robyn, maybe your comment on that same question about quotas.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with Jada, although I will say, like, we've been, we having released the study now 2 weeks ago, it's there are definitely mixed feelings on this. And I think that it stems from a lack of trust, and a very valid lack of trust that change will happen and be sustainable if there aren't some sort of systemic change in the way of quotas. And so I think that's something that we're really grappling with about and talking about a lot in terms of what are the pieces in the whole list of recommendations and beyond that can lead to those changes and lead to them being long-term without necessarily being just checking boxes. I mean, I think there's a lot of formats in things we see in grant writing, in the applications and everything, that really is quota based because there was a framework needed, and without that framework, it either got ignored or confused and then ignored or something like that. And so there is some validity in saying, like, people aren't going to listen and they're not going to do it unless we make it a systemic reason and need and requirement for them to do it. But it is, like Jada said, very complicated. And it's because gender's fluid, because there's so many intersectionalities. I mean, I see often someone's listing, this is the diversity in our programming, and they have somebody who is who identifies as Black, Indigenous, queer, and that in the programmer's mind is 3 boxes. But at the end of the day, it's one person, right? And so I've seen programming even in my backyard in Winnipeg here, where an entire program last year had one person on their entire festival weekend, 2 weekends, who was Indigenous, Black, and female. And that was their diverse programming.
No.
And to me, I was like, that's ridiculous, because that is one person out of 40. So even if you were considering that person in all those intersectional areas as representative, it's not covering everything, and it's not enough. And so when you start putting quotas on different things, it gets confusing and ignored really easily. And it also gets moving towards that box checking where it's like, okay, we've done enough. And it's not about doing enough. It's about doing more than enough. And it goes to the conversation around, or the suggestion around going beyond CanCon. It was really eye-opening to Jada and I had a call last week with a radio promoter who's saying she's seeing stations saying we don't have to do as much CanCon here, we're doing enough here, or we have to raise this and this, and therefore we're going to cut out all of our light package.
I've been hearing that too. Yeah.
And it almost creates this big gap between artists trying to get in and artists in.
It's almost something that you were encouraging in the presentation. Like, we don't want feature programming. We want programming, period. Right?
Yeah.
But then there's this idea of even to for, I guess, on the radio side of things, to build the profile and get to, it's almost like there needs to be more commitment from feature to actual regular rotation, like an actual plan that gets seen through, not just you only get into level one.
Yeah.
But what's worse, nothing at all or feature programming, right? Like, we find ourselves in this kind of debate.
Fair. When you start looking at at the quotas and the check boxes, if you say, there's so many pieces that need to be even discussed in looking at that, even if we were to look at something in that frame where it's like, okay, so you have to have this many women, this many trans artists, non-binary, two-spirit as well, this many Indigenous, Black, people of color outside of those definitions, where is all the representation? What do we all include? And then you have to also filter in how much of that needs to be Canadian versus not.
Yeah.
And then so that you're not just getting all of the diversity in your international artists. And then beyond that, you also then have to look at, if we have these quotas, are they on a weekly basis? Are they on a monthly, a daily basis? Because if you do start putting that by basis, then you could actually be doing a disservice to some of those intersectional artists. Say it's weekly, for example, and in that week, there's no new programming or new material from trans artists that is ready for radio, but they've been eliminated from your recurrent and gold programming, so you can't pop that in that week. And then you're potentially putting someone up who isn't ready, and it reflects badly. It's the same as putting somebody into a job role that isn't ready for it.
They're
just
not trained, yeah.
Diversity, and it makes them look bad because you're not giving them that support to present well in where they are. So yeah. I think really, it goes so much beyond the quotas to looking at actually how do we make sure that it's a no-brainer when you go to put that new music in, you're seeing the information about the artist that you're adding to radio because of changes there. And you're getting more diverse programming suggested in your new list coming from labels, because the labels are conscious and making decisions about who they're developing.
The support pipeline.
Exactly. So, it goes in that whole stream. We spoke a lot with the programmer for Boots and Hearts Festival, who said, I would love to have a very diverse every year headline stage, but when there's only 3 or 4 women artists or artists of color in the country scope being developed, being put on radio, being tested for ticket sales, for audience development, then those artists are very busy, and that's great for them. But it makes it really hard for the programs. We're like, oh, we didn't get them because they're on tour or they're playing this other festival or whatever. There's only so much to go around. And like you said a bunch of times, Jada, it's not a zero-sum game. Yeah. It's not about add this and then we lose this. We've got an outreach from men and women saying, oh, well, if you add this, then it's less opportunity for us. But it's like, you know what? I have some unfriendly responses to that. Because it is more about it's time.
Yeah.
It's time.
I really just want to sort of pull on one piece that Robyn said that I said earlier is that I think speaks to all of radio history and to some of the issues addressed is gold catalog programming.
I knew you were going there.
This is sort of another piece that because these artists have not been played equitably historically in a way that puts their songs into charts and into contention for awards, etc., they have been erased. I think I said something very polite about filtered out or forgotten in the report, but let's call it what it is, erased from musical history because their songs are absent from gold catalogs. And some of these formats program mostly gold catalogs like country, alt rock, active rock, mainstream AC. They are heavy gold catalog programming formats. And so those voices of those stories that have come from women, from Black artists, from Indigenous artists, from trans artists, historically have not been preserved as part of a larger historical, I hate the word canon, but I'm just going to say like larger historical understanding of who has contributed to this music that we listen to currently. So if we can't even like address the historical inequities, then we really can't even start to talk about the currents, because we really don't know. We on this call know a lot, but there's so much forgotten about the way in which that erasure even happened to begin with.
Yeah, ShoShona, let's hear it.
Yeah, I just like to circle back to the quotas, because I really hear what's being said. And you know, sometimes I think that like the quotas don't need to be a blunt instrument. I think the presumption that they do maybe is not, maybe I'm naive about this, but I believe that, you know, they could be a very nuanced, responsive instrument if we choose and there's a will to push it in that direction. I feel that the quotas are something worth discussing more deeply and, you know, considering as a pathway, because it's not just about trust, it's about accountability. You know, as an Indigenous woman, I see like Indigenous people as one of the three pillars. Like, this isn't my perception. I am aware of the fact that Indigenous people are one of the three pillars of this nation. You know, French language is mandated in quotas. CanCon is mandated, but there is no mandate for Indigenous voices, though we have been historically silenced and continue to be silenced. So, you know, I'm a big believer in counterbalance, because I think that it helps us get where we want to be. Like, let's really reach for this and then find our way to some. It's raining a lot and it's going to be noisy.
You're getting a real live look at ShoShona's activism, wherever she is, in whatever environment she's moving in.
But, you know, I feel strongly about calling for accountability. Yeah. And I believe that it's system change that we're looking for. So I think we should be asking for that accountability system-wide, you know, and I'm also a big believer in think tanks. You know, I want to get together all the most beautiful, open-minded, diverse thinking, diverse existing group of humans and start thinking about how to tackle this. Because I think all of society in a generational way suffers from not hearing the stories that represent the wholeness of who we are. I actually think that it informs who we dream to be together. And we are limiting our potential as a society. We're limiting our potential as human beings and within our families without hearing these stories. So I don't think we should be polite about it. I think we should get in the ring. I think, you know, in a loving way, because obviously that's a labor of love. That kind of system change for the future and for what's happening right now is a labor of love. But let's get in there and be brave and not
passive.
Yeah, not passive, but also not limit our thinking to what has already happened. And, you know, I think the reasons that our thinking becomes limited is because we're not hearing all the stories that helps us dream bigger, you know? So I really commend you on the work of this study, because I think, you know, the empirical data really helps us in that to get in the ring. You know, it's just like such an important instrument in making a case for that change and rallying people around the change that I actually believe we all want, you know, and this is not an issue of like, there's not enough talent. I hear it all the time. Like, I don't know. Yeah. It's just like people don't know where to find women that are ready or Indigenous artists that are ready or all of those things, you know, like that's just bullshit. Like, it takes no effort at all because the talent pool is so deep. And yes, there is work we need to do around development. Yes, there is work that we need to do in music education. Like, we need to be getting them young. We need to get into schools. We need to help kids dream to take up a place in this community and this industry. But, you know, I think that when we decide, we can do whatever we dream. It's that simple. So, you know, I'm like, let's do this.
Keziah, I know that you had your finger up there.
I did, and
Get on in the ring.
ShoShona ended on such a great note of dreaming. It's where I think when I think about quotas or no quotas, and I think that right now there is not an answer, and there's not an answer because first we have to allow ourselves to dream. If we look historically to what Jada had mentioned, historically that regulatory process for CanCon, as we look at that, it did push forward a particular group from a particular cultural background. It did prioritize and give fortune to those who were white and in many cases men. And so we have seen the quota method not to be as beneficial as we want it to be. We've also seen the quota and the regulation be not inclusive at all. And so on one hand, if we are looking to repeat history and that quota is tied to what we currently see, then it may not necessarily be the best way forward. But if we think about the ability to dream and come together and holistically understand that in some cases, the kickstart of adding an incentive by way of quota that is phased out, that then affects the person and the culture of the radio station, which then permeates across the industry, is sometimes the kick in the butt that we need to get started. Is it the problem with regulation in CanCon, as an example, is it takes, we're reviewing for the first time in 25 years, Bill C-10, which is the radio broadcast. And so changing that is an incredibly arduous process. So being able to use this in a phase process to say, hey, let's get there. Let's start thinking, because when people are kickstarted into a position, we hope that it becomes their way of thinking. So that phase out process into what we want to see the ecosystem look like will come by one's taking ownership of their personhood, which then changes the culture of the radio station, which then ultimately changes the culture of the ecosystem. So in thinking about quotas or no quotas, it's let's dream and let's not be beholden to what was, but learn from what has happened and the harm that has been caused because of the rigidness. And one other thing that I would say in regards to, we talked about gold songs and, in these formats, AC as one to think about. This is another area where I would look at bringing groups together and holistically understanding what various groups, cultures, people from various parts of the country have listened to. I remember being, if I can, for a quick example, I remember being in a setting where I was hearing the Junos talk about incredibly influential venues. And the venues that they listed included Lee's Palace and the Horseshoe. And for those of you who are listening, those are two venues in Toronto. And I happened to be a publicist in the indie rock scene. That is the only way I knew what those two venues were. There are people who've worked in this industry and been in this industry for 35 years who have no clue what the Horseshoe Tavern is, because it's not part of their upbringing. And so when we think about these gold songs, let's look at those cultures in Canada and say, what did you grow up listening to? And you're going to find artists and people that you may never heard on radio, but are so impactful to the upbringing of the various perspectives that we have here. And so I think that in turn can actually inform what gold is and gives us an opportunity to not say, okay, the past is the past. we're going to listen to Randy Bachman, but instead say the past we can infuse with the past of other people whose voices have been erased or excluded.
Thank you. Yes, to everything that you just said. I think about even my understanding of which artists were even Indigenous. I didn't even think or know about it until I was in the SiriusXM ecosystem, because in my terrestrial radio days, it wasn't even a discussion. I had never had that discussion with anyone. So, okay. I feel like this is the start of much bigger discussions to come. There are so many perspectives and paths that we need to look at. And I think it'd be really interesting if we can gather as a group again for our own look at how well people are receiving the research, what they are doing to become accountable, and what people are dreaming up for the future. But I also think that, the reason that we are here is because, like, by talking about this, we can get average people who are not in music programming or not in the music ecosystem or not in labels talking about these same things and caring more. So in closing, I would love a comment from everyone on your hope for the average person who's hearing about this and maybe really doesn't know a lot about it. What words would you leave them with in terms of engaging? And I'm going to throw to you, Bronwin, because I haven't heard from you in a little bit.
Oh, okay. Right out of the gate. I feel like everybody said such amazing things. I don't even know how to follow that. But I think for folks that aren't in the industry, I would say, like, start fishing in different ponds. Like, I feel like with radio, they fish in one pond, and those are like the genre-based ponds. And, like, don't even get me started on how genres are, like, I feel like they should be irrelevant, and they're only relevant as you need to sell advertising, only in such as it fuels capitalism. So, like, that's part of the issue we find too, is like people are like, well, are there even trans country artists? Yeah, there are. They're just not in this pond that you insist on, like, deep sea mining for the next. Like, country music doesn't even have a diversity in hair color, let alone gender and like and race. Like, it's all blondes with the occasional brunette, like, it, yeah, honestly. So it's like, start fishing in different ponds, like, and looking at other genres, because, like, genres are arbitrary anyway. So it's like, find artists you like and like explore. And that's kind of the beauty of, like, streaming, is like, literally for $12 a month. I mean, I have my own issues with streaming as far as like artist compensation and stuff, but as far as like discovery, like, you literally have basically the entire music industry at your fingertips, and like, start digging into like other pools. And I think that will help you immediately start discovering other artists and like new stories, like that, like what ShoShona said about these stories that need to be heard. Like, that's absolutely true. Like, I find some of like, when I go exploring and hearing these new stories and narratives that are told in other genres from other cultures, like, it's incredible. I find it so, like, beautiful to hear from other perspectives, because otherwise, like, radio kind of plays the same story over and over again, because that story sells ads, and because, like, that story sells Ford pickup trucks, like, because some guy is singing about getting a girl in the back of a Ford pickup truck in every other damn song. So, that's what we're going to play on the radio. So yeah, I would say, like, get out there, get adventurous, like, try some new stuff. And with Spotify, or Apple Music or whatever your streaming platform of choice, there's no risk involved. Like, you lose 3.5 minutes of your time or whatever, but, like, move on to something that works for you. So I'm hoping that as much as radio has influence, that people start to realize that, like, as we in the industry are fighting for change here, you can also start discovering other artists on your own.
Your own personal fight, yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, ShoShona, in closing.
I think it's really easy to feel like we can have no impact, and it's just not true. The power of one is really something, and I think it's really I love what you said, Bronwin. And I love the idea of old school, like making requests at a radio station, like making it known what you want to hear. And it's super easy to make a request. They probably have, I don't know, I haven't done it in a long time, I won't lie, but because I actually don't listen to a lot of terrestrial radio, but it's an in my car thing. So I'm not calling in, but there's forms and things we can fill out. And it's just, and I also think it's like, talk to your neighbors, talk to the people in your circles about it. Let's have a conversation about how we want ourselves to be represented, because this is a time capsule for who we are right now. And I think we all can contribute to what we want that time capsule to be.
Okay. Closing words, Robyn.
I was going to say request too is like, be involved with your station. And if you are, I agree with what Bronwin's saying as well, like go and find the music that's great and the music that's around you and the music that's, whether it's local or whether it's in Canada, but then call your station, call them repeatedly, figure out how you can make a request online and just sending it. Because if they know that that's what you want to hear, you find those places where they'll play what you request, it's gonna start opening eyes. And I think just having these conversations and know that when an artist is played on terrestrial radio, they get paid a lot more than on a stream. So if you can request a song and get it played, you're really supporting the ecosystem for that artist, for their career. And
Keziah?
Everybody's just taking my answers. I was also going to say request. I think what I will add to that is, it was brought up a little bit earlier, think about all the passive spaces where you hear radio and know that your request is going further than that request, but that request gives ammunition to be able to have that artist actually playing in heavy rotation. It could be the requests that actually take that person from a midnight play to daytime. And then that daytime ends up being in the mall that you're at. And so what I would say is start to just be acutely aware of where you are hearing radio. And as Bronwin says, take the artists that you're hearing and discovering on other platforms and bring that to radio.
Mm-hmm. Jada, last up.
Is there anything left? I was originally going to say, go find, request, and like by way of engaging with your station. I do know that stations, especially in the country format, which I know most intimately, do not take kindly to requests. But I do think it's important to keep doing it. Because I think the power of one is important. I think, I just don't know what to add except for be curious about how this all works, and seek out information, because I remember little Jada, who was 9 and obsessed with radio, just thought that everybody who wanted to be on radio could be on radio, and that the best songs were getting onto radio, because that's just how it worked. But 9-year-old Jada has since grown up and recognizes that that's not how it works. And boy, she was depressed when she found out that's not how it works. So I think be curious and let your curiosity go find the artists on Spotify or Apple that speak to you. Request them for sure, but really, really just be open to questioning how these systems that we've long just trusted to give us what's best and what's available, how they work. Because I think here's the teacher in me. I think with harnessing ourselves with knowledge of how these systems have historically worked and how they continue to work today, we become more powerful. Knowledge is power, right? And so I just think that the more we know, and there's so much to be said for just be having that curiosity to learn this history and to understand who's been let through the gate and who's had that gate closed to them, and start opening the gate and finding those artists.
Bronwin was not done.
Yeah, I just got one little thing to add. So it's like, I also think like support artists on all the public platforms, because labels, management companies, booking agents, etc., like they're paying attention to those numbers to show
and
that
taking
you have
a cut.
Yeah, well, sometimes, yeah. And so like, if you're able to support a local artist, that even though you might feel like you're one person, like that's one person buying a ticket, buying a t-shirt, buying, if you're buying the record, the physical vinyl or something, like it shows that there is an audience for that artist. And that's really important. Because sometimes, like Jada said, like country radio really doesn't like doing requests, and some radio stations make it very difficult to do that, just because of the way that they are programmed sort of unilaterally across a network. And so I think it's really important to like, keep an eye out, like follow them on socials and engage with them in other ways, to sort of help them build their audience. Like you like their music, and so like add them to your playlist. And because like I've listened to stuff and friends are like, well, who is that? Like I was listening to Orville Peck in the car, like he gets zero radio play in Canada, but he's huge. Like he's a huge star. Like he just released a duet with Kylie Minogue for Pride. Like that's outrageous. I love it. Like that was the best Pride present for me, as an aside. But because I love them both. I like somebody asked for that for me, I think. But I think it's like he rose to where he is in a very like, I mean, obviously he had like a team around him, and no person is an island, but like he did not have any support from the entire industry in Canada and the radio stations or any of that. And so there are so many ways to connect with artists today, which is really incredible. And so like radio is still very important. And I agree, like if you can request, do request. But if you can't, there are other ways to support the artist that can go a long way to helping them build their profile to then maybe get a booking agent because you went to their little show at the local bar, or, management company will take a look at them because, oh man, they sell a lot of merch or whatever. Yeah. So I think that's important to remember too, that there's not just like one path. If you find an artist you like, support them in all channels.
Oh, yes. Thank you. And you know what? In my sort of final reflection here, I would almost reframe the word request to, or just add a couple words to it. Request, engage, and influence. And I say that because, Jada, remember the story that we covered on your episode of the Women in Media podcast about the one country listener writing about Beyonce. And then all of a sudden that story is all over the internet. And it's enough to put the radio station in a position where they have to respond and take action, right? So maybe requests are an outdated mechanism in some ways. I love the radio stations that would still even have a request show. I don't know if there are any request shows anymore. I started my career with literally a weekend request show. But don't forget your influence as an individual and the ecosystem in which it would make its way to the artist, whether it is a post somewhere, sharing a link to a song somewhere, sharing a playlist, getting mad at something that's not being played on a public forum, a website. Like, you do have power as an individual. And back to the stories, final thought. The reason I have a podcast network now is because I'm more interested in the stories than I am anything else. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of this discussion. You will find more information about this landmark research study that we've been debating today in the show notes and at songdata.ca. And maybe consider sharing this study with a music lover that you know. Thank you so much for listening.